Welcome to the Failing Writers Podcast. Can't stop and chat. In a bit of a rush this week.
Anyway, we don't have time. No, don't even say hello, because we don't have time to say hello this week, because we've got such a monumentally
Seems
amazing...
unfair that you've just said hello twice in that. And we
well,
don't get to
edit
say
those
hello.
out. You'll have to edit those out, because there isn't time. There isn't even time for this, because we've got this monumentally amazing interview coming up. It's not even coming up. It's happening right now, because it's so long and so good. Normally we edit...
Your intro is already getting too long.
It is,
so
isn't
we're
it?
gonna have to
Do it right.
just
Edit
wind it up.
Cut
Wind
all
it up.
this out and just do a really quick... Somebody just say Jeremy
But if
Dyson.
I cut all this out, you are going to look competent, and that is not what I'm after.
Good point.
In the final edit, that is not what I'm looking
Would
for.
just come in and say...
Welcome to the Failing Writers Podcast. Here's an interview with Jeremy Dyson.
Yeah, just do that. Can we do a ditty? No, there isn't time. Can we do a ditty? No, there isn't time. That's a real pity. It's a real crime. So can we do a ditty? No, there isn't time. Why can't we sing a little song? This interview's too bloody long. Why can't we have a little tune? Because Jeremy Dyson's coming back soon. Can we do a ditty? No, there isn't time. Can we do a ditty? No, there isn't time. That's a real pity. It's a bleeding crime. But I just did a ditty. Oh, you cheeky little swine. How did you like it? How did you like it?
So you've met everyone. So Birdie, you've met Birdie before.
Yes, that's right. I mean, it was a while ago, wasn't it, Dave?
It was a very long time ago.
It was probably about 10 years or something, wasn't it? Or more?
I think it was 2009.
Yeah,
I think.
God, 12, 13 years.
Yes. It was like a BBC sitcom writing competition thing in 2009, and I won the prize of having a few one-to-one sessions with Jeremy Dyson, which is still possibly the best prize I've ever won in any competition. Yeah.
Bless you. I mean, it was good. It was a BBC North thing, or it was a Northern initiative, wasn't it? So there were lots of Northern writers. Lucy Beaumont.
That's right. Yeah. Yes.
As I remember. It was good. It was really good.
So a lot of the people there went on to quite some success.
Well, it's always it's really interesting, those things, seeing what happens to people and seeing what people do. Well, on the occasions that I've sort of done things like that, and and you see people's careers unfold.
Decide whether you're going to take credit for it later on.
I think that would be pushing it.
Well, they were in that session with me. They did win a session. I like to think I had a hand in it. Would you like to take responsibility for Dave's?
I like to think that my sort of downwards trajectory was just as a counterbalance to Lucy's onward rise after that.
Yin and yang, one couldn't
Yeah,
happen
exactly.
Without
Yes. In order for her to be on Meet the Richardsons now, I had to do nothing with the rest of my life.
I mean, if that is the case, I'm surprised she's not more famous and successful. If it's like a...
That's true, as a balance, yeah.
To balance it out, yeah.
So tell me about the Failing Writers Podcast in terms of, what you would like to talk about when you have these get-togethers, and, and how I fit in. I was a bit alarmed when I saw it was called the Failing Writers.
Well, we've spent a lot of time, Jeremy, at the start of interviews saying, "Look, right, it's called the Failing Writers, but that's not you. That's us. And kind of apologising, explaining, then apologising again."
We could make that clearer, couldn't we? I suppose.
Yeah,
we probably could. Yeah.
But then at the same time, there's a lot of people that have come on and have immediately jumped into the failing bit as successful writers. Because
it's interesting, as I'm sure many of those other guests have told you, as any professional writer will, I'm sure, is that me and Andy Nyman, we would quite occasionally give a talk on the necessity of failure, because we had a whole thing around with Ghost Stories, the film, when we did the film of Ghost Stories, that it was baked into the process. You couldn't but not only it wasn't something to be endured as a sort of necessary thing that you had to go through. It was actually that you had to embrace it, because it's part of the process, and if it's not showing up, then you're missing an essential part of the process.
Yeah. So
it's not even just a sort of motivational, positive thinking thing of kind of pushing your way through failure. It's actually it's actually part of doing it.
Failure is not an option.
Yes, very good.
I think possibly we're such loving people that we've just embraced the failure part of it a bit too tight. Just can't quite let it go.
Well,
but strangely enough, I had a slightly bizarre story about ghost stories.
Yeah.
So I was watching the movie. I think it was on Netflix a little while ago.
Yeah.
So I was watching the movie, and I texted my friend to say, I'm just watching this film, Ghost Stories. It's absolutely brilliant. And he was at that time sitting there reading the play.
Oh, really?
So yeah.
Oh, that's strange. That's spooky.
Yeah, it is a bit. I thought, yes, maybe something in that. But yes.
Yeah, there was. Well, I mean, the element of failure that we had in that, as for anybody putting any film together, was, you have a lot of rejection and passing along the way, and it's a real roller coaster. And it, but the thing we said, the basis of that talk that we gave was that actually one of the points on it, we had to do for one of the producers producing partners who didn't end up doing it, who one of the distributors who then passed on it. They made us do a 15-minute like a test reel.
Right.
I think partly because we hadn't made a feature film before. So, you had to, it was a bit like doing an exam. You had to go and take 15 minutes of the film and make it. Because
you directed it as well, didn't you? You and Andy, is that right?
Yeah. As we did on the stage shows, so it was very much our thing. And, we couldn't really sanction handing it over to someone else. We both made the decision that just because we were so bound to it that we'd rather kind of do it ourselves, and if it didn't work out, well, so be it. That was preferable to someone else doing it in a way, even if they'd have made a better job of it, which might seem bizarre, but it was an emotional decision. But anyway, so we did this 15-minute test reel, and it wasn't great. It was it was all right, but it wasn't what we hoped for, and those distributors ended up passing, and no thank you. And then it kind of almost, felt like it was on the edge of falling apart as a project. And then we both sort of galvanized ourselves and said, no, we can't come this far and just give up. So we used that as a spur to, right, well, let's go back and let's go over the script. And we had a very thorough go at the script, and another pass at it, and actually changed quite a bit as I remember it. And then also we were very forensic about, well, why didn't that work out? What was wrong with that 15-minute test reel? What was, what didn't work there? And as a consequence of that, we, when we did manage to get it back together, and we found distributors who did want to do it, we fed all of that we learned from it, from that experience, then fed into making the actual thing that we did better. So the thing that we were both struck by afterwards was, well, there is a version where that original distributor could have seen that 15-minute test reel and thought, okay, well, this is okay, let's go for it. And we wouldn't have made any of those changes. And the film would not have been as effective, for those that think it is effective, as it ended up being. It would have been less good if we hadn't have had that painful experience, that rejection, and that
because it was so successful, wasn't it? When the play sort of first came out, it sort of broke box office records in various theatres, didn't it, and won several awards. So it's surprising coming from sort of that to then hear that the sort of film version of it was rejected in its initial form.
Yeah, but then that's common, and in fact, one of the things that most successful things have in common is a huge history of failure behind them that you don't see. There's a kind of, you see the tip of success, and there's an iceberg of failure underneath it. And I'm forever talking, when I'm working with younger writers, which I do a fair bit, I'm forever, citing those examples. And it's so important to know that, because we've sort of got a myth of genius in the culture. You point to certain writers and directors and whoever, practitioners in any field, and call them geniuses, and because legitimately, because they're very talented people. But you never see that iceberg of failure, and yet that's the one thing that all those really successful things have in common. And so I've accumulated over my career all those stories, because I find them so heartening, of particularly things that are pieces of work that I really cherish, that of creative heroes, like 2001, The Space Odyssey, which was a formative thing for me that I first saw when I was about 7 years old.
Yeah.
And the first screening of 2001 that Kubrick gave for the MGM executives was an absolute disaster.
Yeah.
And they all walked out halfway through, and just think he'd given 3 or 4 years of his life to that project up until that point, and invested his own money in it to get it developed initially. And here it was, you've reached that crucial night where you're showing it to your bosses effectively for the first time. And they walked out. So they were on the verge of disowning it. And his wife said that he was sat on the edge of his bed in the hotel room because they'd gone on to New York for it on the QE2 because he wouldn't fly. And so he sat on the edge of his bed, just suicidal, in a state of absolute despondent despair, because he just thought he'd failed, and that it was a sheer hubris, and he should never have attempted it in the first place. And then he woke up the next morning and he picked himself up and he cut about 15 minutes out of the film.
Yeah.
And it became better for it, and then of course the rest is history, as they say.
Yeah.
And and you can pick literally any one of those. I mean, we were watching It's a Wonderful Life again over Christmas, which we do every year. Which is a phenomenal film and a beautiful, beautiful story. And now it's just iconic. It's a film that most people have seen, and just it couldn't be more alive after nearly 80 years or 70 years, whatever it was. But that was a disaster. When it came out,
really?
Really?
It was,
wow. Okay.
Oh yeah. It was a critical disaster.
It did nothing, did it? Yeah, it did nothing at all.
But you wouldn't. It destroyed Frank Capra's career. Yeah, it kind of finished Frank Capra's career.
I mean, to be fair, that little girl's voice is quite annoying when she says every time a bell rings. So I can see, I can see.
Apparently, I think that got traction, wasn't it? Wasn't it played out at Christmas randomly as like filler, basically?
Yeah, it was because
at some point
it had gone into syndication on American television. From the late 50s onwards, early 60s.
It was just filling time.
Yeah, so it was just on.
Yeah,
it was just on, and people found. But then that's the case. So another great example, another formative film for me and my colleagues in the League of Gentlemen was The Wicker Man. And that was a film another film that kind of bombed on its release, and it was released in a double bill with Don't Look Now. It was kind of thrown away because the distributors, British Lion, didn't know what to do with it, and it just came and went. Yeah, it sort of did nothing. And then it started playing on British television, I guess, in the early 80s. I think the first time I would have seen it would have been about 1982 or something like that, on a late night horror double bill, and that's when people found it. It was a good 10 years after its initial release, and then it was a slow burn. Then it sort of just accumulated in the culture.
So what you're saying, Jeremy, is this podcast still has a chance? Is that what you're saying?
Absolutely.
It might take 10 years or some random scheduling, but it might have a chance.
The cows come home to anyone who marks themselves as a failure. Don't write yourself off at all, because you've no idea. You've got to. All you have to do is you just got to stick with it.
Just got to keep failing.
Yeah, keep failing.
I think that last bit was my favourite 11 minutes 26 seconds section of a podcast ever. Can't wait to hear the next bit. Oh, look, here it comes.
So has there been a point, Jeremy, where you've written something and perhaps thought the same thing? You've been sat on the edge of your bed and thought, I'm not sure I can keep doing this. Or did success come relatively early?
Yeah, about three times a week. I have that experience. Yeah, and believe me, there's no hyperbole in that either. That's what you're doing. You're wrestling with that as a creative on a. Well, you must feel. I mean, anybody who does anything creative must has to contend with that.
Yeah.
I think that's part of doing it. It's enough to put a lot of people off, and quite rightly. You've got to have a slightly masochistic streak to want to follow a creative career. I think
that's true. I often think that if you like built a wall a few times a week and it always fell down, you wouldn't keep doing it for 20 or 30 years, thinking one day I'll build a wall that stays
I'll just
up.
keep building very similar, but slightly different styles of walls.
Yeah.
Well, and I'm sure you've come across other. I mean, in motivational books, the example that's cited is Thomas Edison.
Yes, yeah.
Who had those kind of 3 or 4 major inventions, but as he himself said, the ratio of successful inventions to failed inventions was something like 100 to 1, and it was one failure after another. But because the successes were big, you got known for the successes.
You've got to have that sort of burning passion there to keep on going, haven't you? Otherwise, you'd give up. Surely
to do it professionally, I think you have to. Yeah. I think it's different if you're doing it as a pastime or a pursuit or on a different register. But I think for it to be your life and your career, your vocation, you've got to have something's got to be driving you to.
Yeah, well, I think that was part of the thing with starting this podcast, is that none of us could let go of the idea of writing stuff because we all want to do it. So it was all about sort of self-motivation. And part of that in this sort of series, we're having a go at writing something together. So we're going to do some collaborative writing. I wanted to sort of speak to you about that, because obviously you collaborated with the League of Gentlemen and with Simon Ashdown on Funland and Andy Nyman. So is there any sort of tips that you can give us about collaborative writing and how to make it work?
Well, there's probably a few things that I can think of, because I do enjoy collaborating, and actually when I work with Simon, you mentioned Simon Ashdown, and I had a great time with him, and I mean, it was an insane, that show, Funland. And
I love that. It's a criminally underrated show. Absolutely.
I mean, it was insane, so it's not surprising.
It was insane. When I was trying to describe it to people, I do get some confused looks, but
But it was, it was a real hurricane, because we spent about 1.5 years developing it, and then it got greenlit, and we had no time to write it. It was huge. It was like an 11 episode, so it was madness. But anyway, at the end of it, Simon said to me, he said, collaborating is a skill and you're good at it. And I'd never thought of it that way. I'd never thought of collaborating as actually being like a sort of separate skill set from the writing itself. But because he said it to me, I sort of think, I sort of see why you might say that. And one of the things is, well, I guess maybe I learned it with the League. So with the League of Gentlemen, we had this thing. So me and Mark in particular were big Monty Python fans, and you were very aware that with Python, they always said that when they had their, when they were working together, when they were collaborating together, they were quite nasty to each other.
Yeah.
And there was a lot of jostling, and
Terry Jones and John Cleese were at each other quite a lot.
Yeah, they were pretty harsh to each other. So, and if someone presented a piece of work and or a sketch, and someone else thought it wasn't good, they'd just say, "Oh, that's shit," and and it was that brutal. But we were the opposite of that on the League, because we were all very sensitive, and we were sort of sensitive to each other's sensitivity. And it was Steve Pemberton in particular who was very good at this. And so when we came to do our first Edinburgh show, we'd done a lot of material across that sort of first year or 2 years of doing shows in pubs and stuff and little theatres. And so we had quite a bit of material that we'd done. And so rather than having one of those, and then we had to pick an hour for this Edinburgh show. Yeah. So rather than having one of those brutal sessions where you went through it and said, "Oh, that's shit," Steve came up with this really sort of nuanced proportional representation style voting scheme. That was it was very clever. It was all anonymous. So it was like, you voted for the material anonymously, and like a PR system, it sort of took into account first choices and second choices. It was like an algorithm in there, to sort of genuinely bring out them. So you were encouraged to vote for what you really thought was funniest or best, rather than just voting for your own stuff. Yeah. And because it was anonymous, it was about as painless as it could have been. I think that was the thing. and sort of preserved everyone's dignity and actually ended up with quite a good choice by putting all our heads together about what was probably the best stuff. And then we continued in that vein. That was pretty much, that was quite close to the beginning, and then right across even until the work that we did when we did our reunion a few years ago. We carried on in that vein of kind of treating each other with care, I would say, with sensitivity. And so I think, long answer to your question, that's a big element of successful collaboration. I think consideration for the other parties and generosity, and not to the point of sort of bending things so that less good material gets through to preserve somebody's
ego
or whatever. So you don't compromise that far. So you try and stick to the truth of whatever it is that you're doing, but you just go about it in a way that acknowledges that we're all creative entities, we all have feelings, and we all produce work of variable quality. And that's part of the process. And in fact, the more that you can do that, the safer the environment that you make, then the better the work's likely to be, because the more risks you take with the work, that you get higher highs. You'll get lower lows, but nobody has to see the lows, and you get the highs. And so that's why you've got to make it as safe a space as possible. And that's the thing. And then we ended up taking across, me and Andy did when to directing. It's the same. You sort of try and create that same feeling when you either in a company, if it's a stage show, or on a film set.
So was there in the League of Gentlemen then, Jeremy, was there ever any real friction, or did that system kind of work all the time?
There was a bit, but we never had any.
Tell us about the fights, Jeremy. Tell us about the fights.
We didn't really have any big bust-ups. No, it wasn't. I mean, we were all conflict avoiders, which I think, whereas the Pythons were obviously conflict embracers. And but we weren't. We were sort of habitually, we'd rather avoid the fight if we could. So there might have been a bit of behind-the-scenes bitching. But not in any kind of lethal way, just in a sort of acceptable way.
In a tutting.
In a tutty way, yeah. So, you'd sometimes pick up on the shared look between two other people if you'd said something, but it was nothing more sinister than that. You could cope with it.
How did the mechanics of it work? Did you tend to go away and have ideas on your own and then come together and talk about them as a four, or pair up, or how did it kind of start? How did you start the process?
Well, it started as two pairs because we were, we'd been working together independently in that formation. So I'd been writing with Mark, and Stephen Rees had always written together, and there'd been a bit of cross pollination in that Mark had written a one-act play with Steve, and but generally it was built around those two pairs initially. And so, yes, that's exactly what we did. Each pair would generate material, and then we'd come together and read the material. And of course, because you were working with actors, and this isn't something I cottoned onto until I did Funland, which was the first thing I did after the League, was that I took for granted the fact that we had the cast on tap.
Of course.
So that was built into the process. You'd write something, you write a draft of something, and rather than perfecting the draft, you'd get it on its feet.
You just try it out.
Yeah, try it out, and then that became a draft in itself, because you'd hear what worked and what didn't work. And so it wasn't then I had the shock of with Funland. Oh, hang on a minute, we haven't got.
I've got to actually finish stuff.
Yes, got to finish stuff. Yes. So yes, we'd probably have an initial meeting where we threw ideas around as a four. What about this? What about this? Because we all had our little ideas books, our notebooks with ideas for sketches in, or characters, and you'd see what got an infused reaction, and then we'd go off and write up sketches, and then come back together a week or so later and read them out. And that was how it started, and it kind of got a bit looser as it went on. And then I actually started working a bit on my own as well, partly because I felt I sort of, as I've said before, because I wasn't the one that wasn't an actor, so I wasn't on in front of the camera. I sort of a bit neurotically felt the need to pedal harder, as it were. But it wasn't a bad thing for me on a personal level, because it made me work a bit harder, and and so I wrote some stuff on my own as well.
When you came to do, because the third series was quite different in sort of structure from the first two, wasn't it? There was more of a kind of narrative thread through the series, with like the self-contained episodes that all ended up in the same place. Did you do like a lot more sort of pre-planning with that, and to get that sort of structure in mind before you went away and started writing stuff, or did it just kind of fall into that as you came back with ideas?
I think it was quite complicated. Yeah, there was there was a lot of index cards on the walls and stuff. But I think we wrote the material first, so we sort of roughly worked out, I think, that if we were going to do that and try and bring everything together, and it was influenced. There was a series called Holding On that I remember that was just prior to that. Oh God, what's the writer called? He was a really, really good BBC drama writer. I'm going to look it up now. It's driving me mad. But this, as I remember it, Holding On had done, which I think was it directed by Michael Winterbottom? I'm going to have to look at it, such a long time ago now. It was 97. God, yeah. So it was, and it had a great cast. It was David Morrissey and Phil Daniels, and it was quite ahead of its time, actually. It was a sort of box setty conceptual series that was, a good few years before other things of that ilk. Yeah. Tony Marchant. That's right.
Oh yeah,
he was a terrific writer, Tony Marchant. And Holding On had that kind of structure where it was 4 or 5 completely sort of unconnected characters. And you saw how their stories intersected. Yeah. And it was like a different story each week, but then each of the stories intersect, and it was about the connections between people. So I think that was a big influence on that third series for us. And Steve in particular, Steve Pemberton, has this puzzle mind, as you for those that watch inside Number 9, you'll know that, because it often emerges in the episodes. He loves logic games and puzzles and very clever structures, and a thing he has in common with Stephen Moffat as well, who also has that in his writing. And I think Steve was very much driving this thing, although we were all getting more and more hooked on narrative, because the narrative had been there from the first series, and which was a new thing, actually. We were encouraged in that direction by our producer, Sarah Smith, who was a very smart lady, brilliant producer, and she really encouraged us to do that. We'd done it sort of casually on stage as a means to an end, just to get people to come back. We'd done little soap operas for the individual characters, but there was nothing that connected those characters. They were separate, and this idea of putting them all in one place, we were encouraged to do that by Sarah, first on the radio and then to develop that for the telly. So that element, that narrative element, had been there, and that sort of structuring, but it was quite loose in the first 2 series. And then so this formal thing, it was definitely, we were always kind of pushing ourselves so we didn't get bored. We hated the idea of repeating ourselves, and so it felt like it was a challenge to set ourselves, and that's where it came from. So I think once we knew that, we realized you'd need a long story and a short story for each episode, basically. So we sort of wrote those, we divvied them up and wrote them, what the long stories and the shorter stories. And then it was a question of, well, how do you thread it all together? And that was done after the fact, definitely. And that's when it was all index cards on the wall. And it was a pretty involved process.
Yeah, because it's one of those things that seems so complicated. You kind of assume that a huge amount of planning went into it before anything was written.
No, it didn't. It was the plan. I mean, the planning did come, but it came kind of down the line.
Yeah,
and that's not uncommon in comedy. I think we'd all had in our head that thing that John Cleese always said about Fawlty Towers, that his process and Connie Booth's process for Fawlty Towers was, they got a huge roll of wallpaper and laid it out on the floor of their office or writing room, wherever they were writing. It's just kind of like white wallpaper, and they just wrote down ideas for funny scenes in note form and scattered them evenly across this huge unfolded roll of wallpaper. And then they started thinking about, well, which could you connect together?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this is a funny scene. Maybe we could. This one would go with that one, because that one's got a certain, has got something in it that you could connect to this one. And that's how they did the episodes. And it was a very involved process. They spent a long time writing it. And Graham Linehan had a process like that as well. I think, as I remember him saying, where it's basically going. Are any of you musicians? John, you're a musician, aren't you?
A little bit,
Yeah, John's a musician. No, definitely is. Yeah.
Do you know the music software Ableton Live?
Oh yeah.
So Ableton Live's got this brilliant thing where it's got two windows, and one is the session window and the arrangement window. The arrangement window is linear, and the session window is non-linear, and that's the same thing. So, you start non-linear and you just throw up ideas, and then you flip over to the arrangement window to actually experiment with putting those ideas together in a different order until you find an order that works. And that's not uncommon when you're structuring comedy, particularly, narrative comedy, particularly if it's got a farcical element to it. Which is what Fawlty Towers was, and where the structure is everything, or Graham and Arthur's stuff with Father Ted. It's the only way to do it. It's a trick. It's an illusion. It looks like, it's kind of been brilliantly planned and plotted, and indeed it has, but not in the way that you think. So you start non-linear, and just throw up ideas, and then after the event, then you start editing, then you start trying to fit them together rather than beginning with a plot. And it's a much more organic.
That's actually a really brilliant bit of advice.
It is.
Yeah, let the plot organically come out of the actual bits.
That's right. Yeah, and it's not obvious
out of the haphazardness of all the.
And it makes for something. It makes for really enjoyable things if it works, because. The worst thing when you're writing is if the audience is ahead. And it stops the audience getting ahead, because the connections are going to be more unlikely. And so there's much more surprise involved, which is why, Inside Number 9 is so brilliant at surprising you, because Stephen Reese are just, they've done their 10,000 hours on that. So they can instinctively put a story together now like that is just, left turn after left turn. That then you don't see where it's going until you get to the end. Because they're specialists in it, and they're experts.
That is a great piece of advice, and we can make it with the magic of being able to change things afterwards. We can make it look like we deliberately tease that bit of information to help us with what we're doing with this series. That's
right.
Brilliant.
And it's kind of, I guess it applies to everything. I think, a novel that reads as a brilliant novel will, of course, have been edited, and will have had stuff moved around, and certainly when you're making a movie, there's an amount. Most movies will have a pickup shoot where the various bits haven't worked or don't make sense, and so you go out for 3 days and you shoot some extra scenes. To glue it all together and make things make sense, and so it is part of the creative process and writing long stories. It's legitimate. It's not cheating.
While you're offering advice, Jeremy,
yes.
I've been reading some of your short stories in The Cranes That Built the Cranes, or The Cranes That Build the Cranes. Have you? Have you got any wisdom on writing short stories? We've had a go at some on this podcast with mixed results, but is there anything that you try and bear in mind when you approach that form? Or
it depends on the kind of short story that you're writing, but there's a couple of things, there's a few things that from those stories, from my short stories, that because they were actually that was how I started writing before I did anything else. The first thing I did was write short stories. That's kind of how I discovered I was a writer. I didn't when I was a kid. I didn't think about. I didn't write, and I know there are many writers who did, but I wasn't one of them, and I didn't discover that until I was at art college. So I was like 19 when I made that discovery, and it was because it was two things. It was because my final project when I was on my foundation course was it was an insane conceptual thing. It was, and that's to dignify it, to use that language, But it was a sort of video project. It was an installation, is what you would call it nowadays. But I don't think that word existed then. But I did a notebook to go with it, and I'd put fragments of writing in it without really knowing what I was doing. And the one thing that people kept saying when they came round that exhibition was, "Oh, that writing's good. You should write more. I want to read more of that." And no one had ever said that but that was not something that, apart from the occasional good mark for a composition at school or something, it was a new idea. And then around the same time I'd always been into horror stuff and horror fiction and supernatural fiction. And I discovered a writer called Ramsey Campbell, British writer, who's probably our greatest living, he's still alive, Ramsey, still our greatest living ghost story, supernatural writer. And I'd read this book of short stories of his called Dark Companions. And literally that was an epiphany. It was like a light bulb. It was around the same time as the art college thing. And the light bulb went on and I want to do that. That's what I want to do. I want to write stories like that, very specifically like that. So I suppose this is a bit of advice number one if you're starting out. So, and this is common advice, and I'm sure many people will have come across it, which is, you start by copying something that you love. So for about a year, I sort of wrote my version of Ramsey Campbell stories, because Ramsey has a very strong voice. He's really present as an author in his stories. It's a very singular worldview, and it made a huge impact on me. So I taught myself to write by copying Ramsey Campbell. And what I found in doing that was I also brought in a bit of Roald Dahl, because I loved. I think they were probably the first short stories that I really fell in love with. When I was about 13, but I didn't think about writing then because of Tales of the Unexpected on telly. And so I found that I was starting to write a sort of hybrid of Ramsey and Roald Dahl's adult stories, and then through that, it's like riding a bike with stabilizers. Eventually the stabilizers, you dare to take them off, and you find that you're writing in your own voice, and it happens without you thinking about it. You're sort of dimly aware of it, but it's not as formal as that, but you're sort of aware that that's what you were doing. So I think that really is good advice starting out, or certainly, it's a place to start, is not to be ashamed of that. If there's something that you really like, a writer that you really like, just copy them, or just don't be shy about doing that. And then the other thing I started doing around that time was keeping a notebook and being quite diligent about it, and making the discovery quite early on that if you have an idea, you have to write it down straight away, because you will not you'll not remember it. And there's a discipline to do it, because the ideas always come at inconvenient times. They don't come when you sat down with a bit of paper in front of you.
It's mad how often I remember saying to myself, I'll remember this. And that's the only bit of the conversation that I actually remember.
You don't. It's like the universe is testing you, or wherever the muse, wherever the ideas come from.
Like I can remember what the room looks like, how the lighting is, everything about the moment that I say, I'll remember this. And then after that, it's a complete blank.
So, what I learned to do was carry around scraps of paper in my back pocket, and just make sure there was always a pen in my bag, and I always have my bag with me. And then I would, learn that thing even in the middle of the night, quite often I'd wake up with an idea. So, make sure that there's pen and paper near the bed, and don't be lazy, get up and write it down, because you will not remember it.
I always think my ideas are so good that I'll definitely remember them though. But of course, half an hour later, it's already gone.
That's right. So,
notebook.
But then it's a dual process, because it's kind of that's half of it, and then the other half is kind of quite diligently transferring the scraps of paper to a notebook, and there's something about that as well
before they go through the wash.
Well, there's that practical thing, but there's also a kind of a sort of craft thing. I think of it. It's another pass of your conscious mind on it.
Distillation.
And it sort of fertilizes a bit, and then what happens is. What I found was that if you do that without thinking about it, so you don't pay it too much attention, you just sort of get in the habit of doing it. And then it's just like having savings. When you get the knack of saving money, you come back to it a bit later, a bit down the line. So the time has come to write a story for whatever reason, or a bit later for me, it was also a comedy sketch. And you'd get the notebook out, you'd start going through it. And ideas that had seemed either inconsequential or you weren't sure about suddenly were reborn. It's like, oh, that's good. you could, or with distance,
Yeah.
you could see what was the good idea from what was the less good idea, or what, just by what you were interested in or what jumped out at you. So it's sort of, if you did it, accumulated enough and then left it for a period of time, which only had to be a few weeks, it edited itself, as it were, without you having to do anything. It sifted itself, because it was obvious when you looked through which were the things that jumped out. And then that sustained me, that developing that habit across, from starting to write short stories, which was when I did it in earnest, was from the early 90s. I mean, or when they started getting to the point where I might consider showing them to people, right through to the, doing the League and Cranes at Little Cranes, as you say. And the only thing that disrupted it, I was doing that for, nearly 20 years, then was iPhones, because then I started making notes on iPhones and doing the same thing, because it was easier, because the iPhone was always in your pocket and you didn't need a pen. But I found it wasn't, it wasn't as efficient, because what you missed was I was just collecting and I wasn't doing the sifting. And so I'm now returned to the analog method of doing the two-stage process.
Right.
Yes. Yeah, so I'm in the process of going through like about 10 years worth of iPhone notes and transcribing them by hand to a notebook. Notebook and catching ideas, particularly for short stories, because I think a good short story is very often informed by a sort of one strong idea. I find sort of one line ideas almost like a movie log line.
You're very good. You're very good at taking quite a simple idea. You'll take it. It seems like you'll take a simple idea, but you'll just keep pushing it, just seeing how far it'll stretch until it bursts almost.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think that's part of the pleasure.
Whereas I think I always hold back a little bit, almost as though I want it to be more realistic or more, I don't know, a little bit smaller. But I like the fact that, you don't ever seem afraid of just keep stretching, see where it goes.
And it's
and League of Gentlemen's a bit like that as well.
Absolutely.
We were quite similar.
We were always pushing each other on the League. We were definitely pushing each other, and and it kind of made
egging each other on.
Egging each other on, exactly that. Yeah, I mean, I can remember one of the sketches, the one where with the Dentons, the family, where Benjamin comes to stay with them in the first series, and Harvey keeps toads, and there's a sketch in the first series involving urine drinking, and where Harvey tries to make Benjamin drink a glass of his own urine. Now that started life on stage as as a kind of coup de théâtre, which we enjoyed doing when we were doing them in the Canal Cafe Theatre, and that was Steve egging me on, because we were talking about, well, what might Harvey do to Benjamin, and I might have said, not thinking at all that you would ever do it, but just as a stupid, silly suggestion, well, he shouldn't drink his own piss. And Steve said, yes, that. And I said, you can't do that. That'd be ridiculous. And he says, you can. Why can't you do that? And that's a great example of what's great about collaborating, because had it been me on my own, I wouldn't.
What a silly idea. Move on to the next one.
Yeah, or it's too childish, or too or whatever, or just too babyish, or just too dirty, But then you get to borrow off each other in terms of where you'll push each other.
I remember you describing it when we met years ago as like sort of pulling on threads. When you're writing stuff, you keep pulling on thread and sort of see where it goes, see where it ends up.
Absolutely, and that's Bergman's thing. That I got that from Simon Ashdown. Simon Ashdown loved Bergman, and he said that was Bergman's thing. Is that it's all pulling threads, and sometimes you pull a thread and it comes out and there's only an inch there. But then you pull the next one along and it just doesn't stop coming. And you've no idea which thread is which until you start pulling. And that tends to scale up as well. So I stumbled across a brilliant thing from Bob Dylan recently, where it was an interview with Larry Charles, the brilliant comedy director who does Curb Your Enthusiasm, among other things, and did Borat as well. But he did a film with Bob Dylan called Masked and Anonymous about 20 years ago. Strange film. But he loved working with Dylan, and Dylan, he said, gave him the best creative advice ever, which was the path is the destination. It was the way he put it, which is sometimes something works, sometimes something doesn't work, sometimes it doesn't produce anything at all. It doesn't matter which. The point is you just do it, and then you go on to the next one.
Yeah.
And you have no attachment to outcome.
Yeah,
and that's a phrase I've read where else. You do it, and then you do the next thing.
Yeah.
You do that.
I like how poetically Dylan's managed to put throwing shit against the wall and seeing what sticks.
Well, yes, but it's also, I mean, it's throwing the shit against the wall to see what sticks, but also being prepared to do that in public.
Yeah.
So he doesn't do it behind closed doors, and he will release the stuff that doesn't work as well. He doesn't care.
He's just spraying the walls willy-nilly and moving on to the next wall.
More than any other artist music recording artist of his era, he's
not even using a wall. He's just using people's faces.
I mean, he's got a genius, so that even his lowest stuff is somehow has something fascinating about it, if you can call it his lowest stuff. But just that principle of being bold and just daring to do it and not caring.
It'd be easy from the outside, though, to say for someone like him. That's easy to say, isn't it? Because whatever he does will be received well in some parts, and he's got the cushion of a amazing career.
Well, except he had 10 years, at least 10 years in the wilderness, if not more. In the mid-career where he was just kind of, and it's really interesting. Bowie's the same.
Yeah.
David Bowie had exactly the same philosophy of this kind of that restless creative artist of like, you've got to be doing something new, got to be pushing myself, got to be stretching myself, and never wanted to repeat himself. And and he too had at least 10 or 15 years in the wilderness where he was a joke. He was a joke. People, and he wasn't a joke.
Since he's died, though, people are diving back into the stuff that
Completely.
wasn't cool or popular and kind of raising it up. It's kind of, now that there's no more, now that the tap's been turned off, there's suddenly
he gets, that's right, because his death is brilliant, because there's so much in it. Because he dies, you suddenly realise how precious every element of it is.
Yeah.
And then you also see how brilliant it was, because he was an artist, and he's always ahead of everyone else. So you're back to Frank Capra and It's a Wonderful Life. Is that the best artists are always ahead of everybody else. And Kubrick's a great example of that. From a certain point onwards, his films tended to be critically slated when they came out, and then they always followed the same pattern of within 10 years they become masterpieces, because he was just, he was 10 years ahead of, he was certainly 10 years ahead of the critics, if not the audiences.
But just to be clear, we're not suggesting that we should die in order to be successful, are we?
Don't do it in that order.
Okay,
no.
cool.
Yeah. Maybe, I don't know, maybe one of us, John, just to see.
Take one for the team.
But, don't forget, of course, that there's the thing that no creative wants to think about is of course those truly great artists who are venerated for all time, who enjoy no success in their own lifetime. I mean, which painter out there would volunteer for Van Gogh's career? Or Kafka, I mean, who had virtually no success in his own lifetime beyond his own small literary circle, and actually wanted all his work burned before anybody could read it, if we're to believe. So it's a curse. If you're a truly great artist, you're probably not going to find an audience in your own lifetime. But maybe there's comfort in that as well.
I'll take that as comfort on my deathbed. I think it's yet to happen. It's all to come after this moment.
Yeah.
Talking of dead people, I wanted to ask you a question, Jeremy.
Nice segue, John. Thank you.
Thanks. I wanted to ask you a question. I feel like this might get to the heart of like why horror is good. I don't know, but I love ghost stories. And I always have since I was a kid, and I'm guessing you do too. You write them, so obviously you do. But I don't for one moment actually think they exist. But how? But how is that possible? Why should I be utterly? Why shouldn't I be utterly bored by ghost stories? Why do I love them so much?
Well, because they don't exist in our kind of, material world, at least not, you and I would say, not in the way that they do in those stories. But of course they do exist as a literary phenomena, as an archetype, and that's because they mean something. And I think it's what they mean that is the thing that you and I find enchanting in those stories, because a ghost stands for something. It's in a way, it's a kind of shorthand for something that we understand. It's something that our unconscious in particular understands. Yeah. And those of us who like having their unconscious stimulated in that way, which isn't everybody, but it's still a sizable constituency. So they're separate things. It's like how it functions in the story is not the same as how it functions in life. And if you were to get deep about it, you would say it overlaps religion in that way. In that, there's certainly one can get a long way reading religion psychologically, not all the way, but you can, certainly, well, people like Carl Jung or Joseph Campbell, devoted their careers to looking at religion through a psychological lens, and I think you can do the same with ghost stories and fantasy. Full stop. It's kind of a bit like a dream, it's a bit like a dream on paper, and in the same way that you can interpret a dream, or a dream can have surprising meanings, so can supernatural.
But I suppose what I mean is the fear, like the actual atavistic fear that you can wash over you when you're reading a ghost story. It always just shocks me when I get the proper shivers. It's a very strange thing.
Well, that's really interesting, and we did a bit of a study on it when we were informally, me and Andy, when we were working on the play of ghost stories, and again when with the film, in that those are actually there's a look, you can get into the biology of it, the neurobiology of it, which is really interesting. And Andy's very friendly with Richard Wiseman, Professor Richard Wiseman, who you may know from his books and quirkology, and he's a real life professor of parapsychology, or he looks at a lot of this stuff, and and he talks about it in terms of evolutionary psychology. So a lot of that response that you're feeling is actually the prey response. It's a circuit in your brain. It's that fight or flight instinct, and so when you look at a lot of ghost stories or scary things, they have certain elements in common. So one of them is physical isolation. Think about the Overlook Hotel in The Shining, cut off from all help. Darkness is another obvious one. Besides being alone, you put that together, and you've basically got a caveman, away from his pack, away from his hunting party, and he's suddenly very vulnerable. And Richard gave us this great example of why we. That phenomenon of pareidolia, which has a big overlap with seeing ghosts.
Seeing faces and things.
You think you see a face. He said there's absolutely evolutionary psychology can account for that, because if you're in that situation of being vulnerable on your own in the dark. So imagine you've gone deep into a cave as a caveman on your hunting expedition. And, to be successful as a hunter, you have to take risks. There we are. I'm daring to fail again. But you go into that cave and you think you see a face.
Is it a bear? It might not be a bear. Is it?
You think you see a bear in the dark, but you flee. Either way, your genes are gonna survive, because if it is a bear, well, you've been right to flee. But if it isn't a bear, if your brain has made a bear out of two rocks and a stalactite,
sounds like a blue pizza.
There's no evolution.
and then they get a bear from underneath that looked exactly like a bear. They look nothing like the rock and the stalactite.
But there's no evolutionary disadvantage. So you see, we're bred to see ghosts, in other words, because we're bred to be a little bit neurotic, because there's a survival advantage in it. So when we're alone in the dark, we're bred to see ghosts, and so a good ghost story plugs into that mechanism. And if you think of a story is another version of virtual reality. Good story, you immerse yourself in it and you imagine yourself in it. And so that's what's happening. You're on your own, and there's a predator.
Yeah.
And so that's going on.
Actually, there's an interesting little side thing on the horror thing there, isn't there? Of when you're watching horror sort of stuff, there's very much why did they do that? Oh, I wouldn't do that. What are they doing that for? Do you know why are they running through the woods? Just
they call
the police. What were you doing?
Hollywood studios now call that a nope moment. So if you're making if you're making a film for Blumhouse, you've got to make sure you've got at least one nope sequence, as in nope, don't go down there. And that's why, because you have to contrive a character doing that so that you can create those that it
goes against those biological instincts. So therefore it's stressful because you can sense the danger
and you feel it. You become that character when you're watching them, and so you're experiencing it too. It's a sympathetic reaction,
apart from where they push it too far and the character is too stupid, and after about the third stupid thing you start going, well, I hope she dies.
That's true.
I guess that's the thing, isn't it? When something's really good, you're not sort of really processing it with your conscious mind, are you? You're just sort of going along with the flow, and in your sort of unconscious mind, nothing's going through sort of logic and reason. It's just sort of happening, and you're experiencing.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that's David Lynch would say that definitely, that cinema is the thing it's closest to is dreaming. And the language, the grammar of cinema is very like the grammar of a dream. And so, in the way that a dream will suddenly cut from one location to another, and you don't notice it, and you'll shift perspectives in a dream. So when D.W. Griffith came up with all that grammar of editing back in the 1920s, 1910s, that's what he was doing. He was kind of plugging into his own unconscious observations of how dreams work, whether he did it in a thoughtful way or not. And so that's how we can understand a film, because actually, if you take a step back from a film, it shouldn't make any sense at all, because it's crazy. And they have that thing of where they show it, those experiments been done where they find a tribe in the Amazon that's not been near any culture whatsoever, and they sit them down in front of a film or a television program, and they literally can't understand it because they've not been taught the grammar, whereas we imbibe it from. Apart
from Police Academy, I think they always like Police Academy, don't
they? My wife's favourite film.
Is it?
Oh yeah.
Really?
Come on.
Well, among
her
favourites. You back down from that one pretty quickly, quite wisely.
Remember to spread the word and tell your friends about the Failing Writers podcast. What's that? Your only friends are existential dread and an overwhelming yet vague sense of disappointment. Right. Yeah. Okay.
So last time I saw you, Jeremy, you were talking about working on Good Omens. I think you'd.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I think you'd just been on a Zoom call with Neil Gaiman, which is.
Oh wow!
Yeah,
cool.
yeah.
How was that little adventure?
Yeah, I mean, I can't actually. I'm not at liberty to talk about the details of our episode, but I can talk about the fact that we did it and the process. But I can't.
Of course.
I'm still under my oath.
When's that due out? Is there a date for that yet, or is it still?
I think it's two. I think it's 23. I think it's because they're still filming. Yeah. They're filming through till February,
right?
And then there'll be a massive post-production to be done on it. So. I imagine it'll emerge in about a year or something like that. But I don't know. I don't think they've talked about. It's not. I don't think it'll be before that. I don't think it'll be this
What
year.
Was Neil like?
What was Neil like? He's wonderful. He's lovely. He's brilliant because I've worked on other people's shows before. I worked on Killing Eve, and where you're coming into a pre-existing thing, and sometimes that can be quite an exacting process because it's quite a formal process, and you have a writer's room and you have to outline things in great detail, and the outlines go back and forth, and it can be quite drawn out. And so I assumed that with Good Omens that it would be like that because of it's a bit like being handed the family silver. It's a show that people cherish. and the big surprise was Neil said when me and Andy did that Zoom with him, and I said, we were just talking about it, and basically he had an idea for a starting point for a story, and then and then, but it was a bit like Consequences, he kind of gave us this first scene, and then it was like, and then it was up, we could do what we go where we wanted with it. So I said, so I assume you'll want us to do an outline, and he just said, well, do you like writing outlines? And I said, well, no, not really. He said, well, no, just write a script. Just write a script.
That's very trusting.
Well, yeah, and he said it was because his first TV, he's written TV, he said his first TV job was actually doing an episode of Babylon 5, and he'd said the same thing. I can't remember the guy's name, the creator's name, but he'd had that conversation. Shall I do an outline? And that's what the guy had said to him. Do you like writing outlines? And he'd said no. He said just write a script. And because he was trusted to do that, he sort of responded. He felt he rose to it, rather than being micromanaged. And so he kind of afforded me and Andy the same gift, really, of trusting us.
Oh, nice.
And it was such a thrill, and it ended up being so enjoyable because of that, because your experience is usually the opposite of that, where I'm not denigrating it, because they're just different ways of working, but it's unusual to do it the way that because it's normal.
You feel you're being watched more. Usually,
and you understand why. It's expensive and difficult to make television, and but nevertheless, because he was the boss and it was his thing, he was at liberty to do that. And then so we just had so much fun writing it, and then I think that transferred. It meant that the script carried some of that energy.
Yeah, and then Neil gave us sorry and said, actually, no, that's rubbish. Go back and do an outline first.
It wasn't as dramatic as that. I mean, there were adjustments. But it was all very, very. It was like the League of Gentlemen. It was very sensitive.
Right. Yeah.
It was. It was great. I'm so glad we did it. I think it was, and it was a double bonus because it's my youngest daughter. It's her absolutely favorite thing. So the sheer pleasure of them being able to go in once we got the gig and say, guess what I'm doing.
Yeah, the cool point.
But again, Neil said he had exactly that with his daughter, because his daughter was a massive Doctor Who fan, and so he did Doctor Who episodes, and he was just that exactly the same thing. He said I know you'll do me a good episode now because you cannot fail your daughter. And it's true. I gave it to her to read before we gave it to Neil to read, and I was more scared about her response than I was about what he was going to say.
As good as a guarantee.
He would be more forgiving.
Did she have to sign an NDA before she read it?
Actually, that's a very good point. I think she's smart enough to know not to go blabbing about it. I hope.
Yeah. We won't tell anyone.
How did that gig come about, Jeremy? Was that just a call from your agent, or do you know how you got recommended for it?
It was through Andy, and this is how a lot of stuff happens. It's often informal rather than, I mean, not always, but it can be informal, and that was informal. What had happened was Andy had been a get together at Jonathan Ross's house. Andy's friends with Jonathan Ross, and Neil was there. I think Andy had met Neil a couple of times, but Neil was there, and Neil just said that it was just said, we're looking for writers to do. They were looking for a number of writers to do to work on these sort of episodes within episodes, I think. And so he said, would you and Jeremy be interested in doing it? And that was as simple as that. And then we just jumped at it for obvious reasons. So
that's possibly the most showbiz story we've had on the podcast, I think.
Because Andy was at Jonathan Ross's house.
Yeah. I'm also thinking, we've mentioned Jonathan Ross an awful lot on this show, but I think that's the first time a guest's ever mentioned.
But Andy, you can. I mean, I'm not terribly showbizy because in that sense of going around to Jonathan Ross's house. But Andy being an actor absolutely is, and he has an address book like you would not believe. I mean, my favourite story is that when we started pre-production on Ghost Stories the film, Andy said, "I know what I'm going to do. I'm going to email some of the directors I know and just ask them for a single piece of advice, just to see what comes back." And you would not believe the list of directors that he had. Had the emails for that he's on friendly terms with, and then B, how quickly they fired back their emails. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. Within 15 minutes, there was like, and I'm not going to go through the list because it'd be sound like shameless name dropping, but within 15 minutes, there was an email from J.J. Abrams.
Bloody hell.
And well, I won't go on, but that's where it started. It started with J.J. Abrams. So yeah, wow. Andy's very different to me in temperament and in address book as well.
Wow. Andy's talking to J.J. Abrams, and you're talking to the failing writers. So
yeah, who's winning? Who's winning tonight?
In London,
yin and yang again, isn't it? One of the other things, Jerry, just to sort of zip back to the sort of sketch world, one of the other things that we're going to be doing in this series, we're sort of setting ourselves the challenge of trying to write a sketch show for the podcast. So, because you've obviously written sketch shows, you also worked as a script editor on a few, like Armstrong and Miller. Mm-hmm. What do you think makes a good sketch? Do you have any sort of tips?
Yes, it's very like a good short story. It's like a really short story. And so it's all the same things. So a strong idea, often with a twist in it, a reversal. That's a sort of good prerequisite. I mean, actually, on Armstrong and Miller was a case in point. That was. I mean, the thing about doing a sketch on is that they're such hungry beasts. That's what we used to say. The amount of the ratio of material you have to commission to material you can actually shoot. There's a kind of like 6-to-1 ratio. It was so the volume of stuff that was coming in that you were wading through, and then all the stuff that ended up getting done always had a sort of a simple one-line idea, that was like that made you laugh when you heard the idea, like a joke. It's like a joke, same as a joke. A sketch is essentially a joke. So in the way that a good joke is a story with a beginning, a middle, and a punchline, that's a good sketch. So a good way of kind of learning those rhythms is kind of immersing yourself in jokes. Watching a great traditional sort of 70s stand-up who told jokes. Less of those now, of course. But if you think about, say, Les Dawson or I know you can't even say Bernard Manning, but Bernard Manning,
the wheel tappers.
Yeah, the wheel tappers lot. That kind of form of joke telling. Well, they're like sketches. They're little stories, and they often have morals, or they make a point, or that surprises you at the end that you don't see coming, just like a good short story. And so that's a good way of thinking about them. And of course, character. I think it's a fusion of that with character and observations. So with the League, lots of the sketches started life with little bits of truth, so fragments of overheard conversations. And so Stephen Reeves were great for that. They'd always have their ears open when they were out, because they lived together when we were in the early days of the League, and so they'd go out for a meal and or go down the shops, and they'd hear a snatch of something that made them. So something that has the quality of an anecdote will also make for a good sketch. So they once heard a great conversation between these three businessmen, sort of miserable middle-aged businessmen, who were kind of showing off in a restaurant. And they heard that there was coherence enough that they could come back and tell the story of these three businessmen who were very strong types. Well, they morphed into the characters of the three businessmen in the League of Gentlemen that carried on right through all the series. And it all started with an overheard conversation and a couple of lines of, what, you've never done Congers? I think that was one of the lines, meaning Hong Kong. You've never been to Hong Kong. You've never done Congers. And that it was that fragment of conversation it had so much of that man's personality in it. So I kind of learnt at their feet, actually, because that had never occurred to me as a method before. But, I kind of observed that working in practice. And so I started doing the same thing. And I got a fragment of conversation on a train journey of two men behind me playing cards. And one was slightly lording it over the other because he knew the rules, and there were three of them, and two of them knew the rules, one didn't, and the two that kind of were in on it called each other young man and sir, they were probably, I guess they're in their 30s, and they said, "Thank you, young one. My pleasure, sir." And it was such a thing. It was just a little tick that you thought, "Oh, I recognise that," and I wrote that down, and then that became a sketch in the league of, it was a very easy sketch to write of that, just that 3 men playing cards, but I just kind of pushed the absurdity of it, and they're trying to teach the other man how to play the game, and it's got ridiculously complicated rules.
Go Johnny, go go go.
Yeah, that's right. Go Johnny, go 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 go. And it was that same thing of it was a little fragment of an overheard conversation. So yeah, those combination of those things of a story with a moral or a twist and character and a bit of truth is a good template.
Do you know, it's only now occurring to me that I should have asked you that question before submitting some sketches to the Armstrong and Miller show.
2009 when you had the chance.
2009
when he was there. Oh yeah.
Yeah, and of course they don't really do sketch shows in the show. There's not they're so expensive to do.
No.
There's I can't think. I mean, there was Famalam recently, which I really enjoyed.
Yeah.
But there hasn't been many sketch shows in recent years.
They'll come back around though, won't they? They always.
Yeah.
It's always quite certain.
Yeah, I guess they will. Yeah.
There seem to be a lot more sort of audio-wise.
Oh yes, I think that's true. They're easier to do.
Well, they're cheaper, aren't they?
Yeah. I heard one called.
Jeremy.
Oh, sorry, Tom. But I was just going to say, what was that one? The Sink, which I think was out recently, which I've talked about a bit, which I think is very much sort of influenced.
Oh yeah, I've not heard it, but I've heard people speak of it.
Yeah, I think that was sort of very much influenced by the sort of narrative sketch style of.
That's very Lynchy, very dreamlike, isn't it?
Yeah.
Yes, go on. Tom, were you asking a question?
I was going to, just while I was doing my revision this afternoon, which just involved me watching my favourite bits of League of Gentlemen. A quick question, was it filmed in front of an audience, League of Gentlemen?
The first series was filmed in front of an audience, and so a proper audience at Yorkshire Television, which was a huge thrill to us because it was the same. It was the big YTV studio where they'd done Rising Damp, and we were huge Rising Damp fans, and so that was.
I thought you were going to say where Richard Whiteley used to do Calendar. Oh, love a bit of Richard Whiteley.
I think that was the smallest. They had 3 studios at YTV. It was the big one where they used to do 3-2-1. So yeah, that first series. What it was a combination of obviously pre-recorded stuff shot on location that was then loosely edited together, intercut with stuff that was actually performed in front of an audience.
The film stuff will be played into the audience as well.
That's right. And then but the stuff, a good third of it at least, if not more, was done in front of the studio audience on the first series. Then for the second series, we didn't do the studio audience at YTV, although we still shot at YTV. And what we then did was actually edited it all together loosely and then played it into an audience at the Radio Theatre in London. So it was still played to an audience. It wasn't canned laughter. I thought there was in the sense
sort of posher, more southern laughing on the second series.
Well, that's right. And then the third series didn't have.
It's funny because it just stuck out a mile. Because I think it's speaking about how things go in and out of fashion and they're circular stuff. Doesn't really have it on anymore, does it?
No, and it's interesting because we had a long debate about it ourselves of like, because it was very much, the kind of hit thing would have been not to have the audience on it. It was never cool to have a studio audience. But it was John Plowman who was our exec, who's a brilliant comedy god, who said, "Oh no, you should have the audience." And he kind of made a really intelligent case as to why you want an audience on it. And he said, yes, it's imperfect, but it's really welcoming. And people say they don't like it, but actually that's not true. They on an unconscious level they do like it, and he's very smart and very wise, John, and he kind of convinced us. And so aesthetically it's not the most pleasing thing, or it's certainly not the pure comedy hipster in you resists it. But then the showbiz person in you, the theatrical person, absolutely gets why you do it.
And of course, there's a difference, isn't there, between studio audience laughter and kind of 1990s American sitcom canned laughter.
Yeah.
And
most things that, where they get that accusation slung at them that it's somehow fake, it's not true. All that American stuff was done was always done in front of a live audience.
Right, it's just Americans.
Well, I think the process, there might be a bit of punching up and, shifting laughs around, so they're not necessarily married to the bit of the sketch or the bit of the sitcom that generated them. So there's
I do that a lot when I'm editing the podcast.
Yes, well,
I'll say something that I think's funny, but John and Dave don't.
Well,
but when it comes out, there is quite a lot of laughter underneath it.
It's the same principle. Yes.
Like this, watch. Hedgehogs.
But yeah, it's not in vogue at the moment. I've had Mrs. Brown's Boys.
So it probably is in vogue then, isn't it?
Yeah, it's coming back.
It's probably time for it.
If you were going to do it, you should put it on.
Yeah, I think I'm slightly out of touch with what's happening in the contemporary comedy world, but it is probably time for it.
So for our sketch scene, what we have to do is have canned laughter and do mother-in-law jokes. We've got it. That's brilliant. I think that's.
Well, listen, I think you'd clean up.
Said us well, yeah.
I think you. I think. I mean, look that's what Peter Kay did. He came back and sort of almost reinvented that, didn't he, for a new generation? Yeah. So it's it's probably time for that to happen again. Yeah.
Fantastic.
So what's next for you then, Jeremy? What's on the horizon?
Well, I'm in. So me and Andy are doing. We've got a new play that we had a first reading of it back in towards the end of last year, and so we're just doing some more work on it on the back of that reading. But I'm guessing that probably won't make it to the stage until probably early next year at the earliest, just because of the theatres are still in quite a febrile state. Post-pandemic.
And should we expect something quite macabre?
It is in that territory again. It is in that supernatural territory again. Yeah, although it's quite different to ghost stories. And we've also got a new film as well that we're in that is fully scripted now, and we're just putting it together. So,
cool.
But as to when that's crazy. You can't make predictions about. All I can say is as soon as we can get the finance in place for that, we will be making it. But it's certainly ready to. It's at that stage where we're able to send it out. So, and then we've done another third or fourth Nyman project, if you count Good Omens. Is we've done a book together as well, which is an adventure story about a magician who became a spy magician. That's due for publication in kind of spring next year, I think.
Oh, amazing!
So. There's all media covered.
Yeah.
And,
watch out,
really
2023.
Yeah, watch out, 2023.
Are you allowed to tell us? Are you allowed to tell us what that book's called, or is that still?
No, so it's called The Warlock Effect, or at least it's called The Warlock Effect at the moment. I think we announced it under that title last year. So the magician's called Louis Warlock, and that's that.
Amazing.
That's its current title.
Excellent. And could you give us the log line? Can you sell it to us?
It's set in the Cold War, or the dawn of the Cold War, and Louis is he's a kind of leading magician in his day, who has a very successful radio show, which they did a lot in the 50s. They had a lot of magic on the radio, unbelievably, and he gets seconded into the intelligence services because of his magic, his skills at deception, and but gets drawn in. It's a very twisty, turny story.
Brilliant! Sounds great.
It does sound very intriguing.
Yeah, and it's obviously Andy's got a lot of experience in that world of magic because he's worked closely with Darren Brown for many years. So he's drawing on that. And I'm just as interested in that as well, although I've never been professional. But it's a thing we have in common, yeah.
Sounds amazing.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for talking to us, Jeremy.
Thank you, Jeremy.
Absolutely amazing.
No, it's a pleasure. A joy to talk to you. Lovely to speak to you again, Dave. And
it's been a very long time.
Yes. Well, all the best. See you soon.
Thanks, Jeremy.
Bye.
Thanks, Jeremy. Bye.
And there you go. Well, there's nothing really to add to that, is there?
Loads of stuff in that, wasn't it? Really good depth.
What a lovely man.
Wasn't he? Yeah, super.
Yeah.
Yeah, seriously. I suppose the only thing we need to do is give a massive thank you to Jeremy for hanging out with us.
Yeah, and giving us, because we didn't have,
Yes.
we took a lot of his time up. That was the edited down version.
We did,
We
yeah.
That's true.
We did. We sort of looked up and saw
for
that we'd
hours.
been talking for about an hour and 20 minutes. Didn't feel that long, but
No, well, he just knows so much about so
Yeah.
many things, didn't he? Like everything. He was like a little repository of information about every little thing. He had like a little saying or a little pearl of wisdom about every
He either knows a
topic.
lot about a lot of different things, or he's very good at bullshitting.
Yes. It
We
could
just
be
lapped
that.
it up.
Yeah.
Oh,
We
yeah,
should-
Jeremy says.
Somebody should fact check
I
everything.
don't think we
that
want
he's
to
just
encourage
said.
people to start fact checking the podcast. Dave.
yeah, this
That's not
podcast. Yeah.
Go.
No, that's true.
But yeah, what a lovely guy, and he's posed for us in a Failing Writers T-shirt
That's
as well,
true.
which I'm pretty certain he now wears.
Yeah, he probably wears it to
exclusively.
sleep as nightwear. When he was saying about jotting down his ideas as they come
At
to
night.
him at night.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I would imagine that's helping him
yeah.
come up with even better
Spurs
ideas.
him on every time he looks down
Yeah.
at that little logo. I don't want to be like them.
I
I'm
don't
gonna
want to be
write
like
this
them.
note- Write me notes down.
Quite possibly. I think that's probably the position we play in a lot of people's lives right now, Dave.
Yeah, exactly. We're-
Very
Motivation.
inspirational. but
Yeah,
for
kind
kind
all
of
the
like
wrong reasons.
reverse inspiration of like, you're having a bad
Mm.
day and you've not really got much written and you've read it through and it's a bit shit. And you think, well, I'll listen to these.
Yeah.
I tell you what, it could be worse.
Tell you what, it's only on hearing that back, because we actually recorded that a little while ago. It was only on hearing that back that we said we'd write some sketches in this series, and I'd conveniently forgotten
I
that.
think we had half an idea to perform them live, didn't we? As part of that was a.
We might
Is that
have
our
said
first
that.
challenge of the series?
Did we actually say that out loud, or did we say
I
that
think off
off
mic?
mic?
I think it was in our
Oh.
interim discussions of what kind of
Okay.
exciting things we could do in this season.
Oh, so we don't have to do it.
God,
then,
I've
do
just
we?
put it on mic.
Oh, bloody hell. Right, we better.
So, yeah.
That's a challenge
I
for
think
us
once
to,
we've
to
finished
take up.
writing the sitcom and the other stuff that we keep.
Yeah, and your book.
Yeah, book
finishing
and
your
play
book.
and
and
yeah.
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 And life and everything else. But anyway, yeah, that's for another day. Talking of another day, the fun doesn't stop here, although it probably should have done because this is quite a long episode by now. But what's coming up next week?
We're talking a little bit. Well, we've got a couple of short interviews with people involved with the David Nobbs Memorial Trust, which is a charity that gives a bursary to an up-and-coming comedy writer to help them write more comedy,
Yeah.
I guess. So we're going to talk a bit about competitions and entering writing competitions.
Yeah,
and
it almost all ties in nicely because that's how I met Jeremy, wasn't it? Was in a competition, so it's almost like there's a plan to this series.
We're going to talk to the writer who actually won it as well, which is it's always good to hear.
Yeah.
How they did it.
Yeah, I'm not. I don't think we need to mention the fact that I entered that competition and didn't win. We don't need to say that, do we? We can speak to the winner, and I'll just try. I won't be bitter about
Although I
it
think
or anything.
if
yeah.
you listen back to the interview with Margaret Cairborn-Smith, you will find that there are elements of. I assume it's comedy bitterness, Dave, but I don't know if that's just you masking. I don't know if it's like a double bluff.
It's just
I don't know whether you've gone like full.
Yeah,
full bitter.
that's just my resting bitter voice.
I think.
is what I have. Yeah.
I think there is a stage where you do actually blame her for not winning.
Did I?
But apart from that,
Yeah. Okay.
no, it's all
Oh
good.
well, yeah, we can skip over that, can't we? But yeah, let's leave it until next week because we really don't have any more time to discuss it right now.
No. So thank you very much for listening, and please do think about leaving us a review, subscribe, and please do share. If you enjoy the podcast, then obviously go and get some help first and foremost. But do share with friends. Do spread the word for us, please, because it really does help.
Until then, thanks for listening.
Draw.
See ya.
Bye.
Hello.
Hello?
Where's everybody gone?